Hello, everybody. I know that nowadays with programs like MAME and many freeware and very cheap reimaginings of classic arcade games, we don't really need this kind of compilation, but hey, I'm still going to talk about Firebird's arcade classics for the Commodore 64.
RetroKork.
Arcade Classics is an imitation of 4 classic arcade games. After all, you could only play the actual arcade games back then in the arcade, which probably will lead to a no duh from a lot of you. Still, while adaptations and ports of single games weren't completely unheard of, compilations were much less common. Plus, the computer game versions were sold even in countries where arcade machines were lumped together with fruit machines or slot machines, which were pretty much limited to gambling halls. And as a minor, you couldn't get into a gambling hall. Nowadays, you pretty much find no arcade game in gambling halls anymore, but then again, you hardly find them anywhere, even in countries that had quite a thriving arcade scene, except Japan. But back to the collection at hand. What games are in it? Well, there's Space Invaders by Taito, Asteroids by Atari, Snakes, which is a very generic name for games like the Snake game on your mobile phone maybe, but it also encompasses the light cycle kind of games, and Space Wars, which is Space War, except as an arcade machine by Cinematronics. Space Invaders, well, it plays like Space Invaders. Admittedly, the game feels more a bit like it's based on, say, the ColecoVision version of the game. But the sound is representative of the arcade version, which had no proper background music, only the sounds that went in sync with the Alien Force movements. Works wonders for your blood pressure, but I feel this version is a bit too slow actually, and therefore quite a bit easier compared to the original arcade hardware version of Space Invaders. And this is where I encountered the main problem with this compilation. You need to reset the computer when you want to switch to another game, so modern emulator users may prefer to use some sort of save state within the arcade portion when playing on these simulated quarter guzzlers. Asteroids, or as the Caps Marquee says, Asteroids, Astroids, which probably is the name of the game in Dr. Doom's Latveria, is strangely enough called Rocks in Space on the title screen. Also, unlike with Space Invaders, you still hear the arcade music loop, at least on the title screen of the game here. But I find that music loop a little bit too relaxing. The game also had an obvious downgrade from the vector graphics that you found in the arcade version, where the screen actually was just drawn with the lines basically on the screen and not a raster image with pixels. Simply because I can tell that the asteroids are all just differently scaled versions of one and the same sprite. Also, I think here the hyperjump takes longer than on the original hardware, but considering that there are hundreds of clones of asteroids, I can't be 100% sure. So let's go on to Snakes, or Worm Wars as it's called on the title screen. These games were originally inspired by Gremlin's arcade machine Blockade, where you went through a maze as a worm. Snakes or Worm Wars is a twist on the genre as you have to deal with both the opposing player and the fact that you eat to grow. Well, still, not the greatest game ever. Oh, and you get to hear the arcade music the whole time through. Okay. The music also stays with you through the entirety of Space Wars, which, as far as I understand it, is a somewhat accurate representation of the game. But since it requires 2 players, I can't really fully judge it. However, I've managed to get my player stuck by disabling the star in the center. Just so you know. Overall, the compilation is not the greatest thing since Sliced Bread or Space Invaders, but it's an applaudable effort to squeeze 4 relatively full-scale games into the memory of the Commodore 64. I think the weirdest thing is that 2 games have had name changes from the arcade to the title screen, and one of them would have been easy enough to still call it Snakes. Like I said, the game has 1 music loop and then somewhat accurate sound effects for the different games. However, graphically, the vector-based games, which originally are Asteroids and Space Wars, well, they've suffered a bit due to the change to pixel-based or raster-based graphics. You're probably better off playing these or very similar titles, i.e. clones, for modern systems, or at least unmodern systems, since nowadays you have higher resolution and much more processing power, which allows for a better representation of the arcade game. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'm going to play this fighting game where people throw fireballs at each other and one of them is green with an orange tuft of hair. I believe it's called Green and Fireballs 2, Peter Flurry or something like that. Oh, just before I forget. Next time I'm going to cover the adventures of Bond. Basilton Bond. And yes, that's the game's name.